Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. On today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm joined by Jeremy Herder, who is an Australian author and historian and a former Australian diplomat of some 9 overseas postings. But of particular note, he was Australia's first High Commissioner to Zimbabwe, and he was also High Commissioner to Fiji. And today we are talking about one of Australia's most esteemed diplomats, James Plimsoll, or as you have written about him, Jeremy, Jim Plim, Ambassador Extraordinary. So welcome to Afternoon Light, Jeremy.
Thanks very much.
It's an amazing story, the story of James Plimsoll, and as I reflect on it, it's also the story of a coming of age of Australia too. His career through the World War II, Korean War, the Cold War, and then through to the end of the Cold War and his sort of end of his career in Tasmania, of all places. But how did he start off his career? Tell me about a young James Plimsoll or Jim Plim.
So many of them, Georgina, when they started in that immediate post-war period, came in all sorts of different ways. But Jim Plim started because he was part of a brains trust that was set up for the Chief Australian General based in Melbourne. And then as the war came to an end, Plimsoll and about 4 or 5 other Australian officers went to a special Army Staff College course in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the United States. And Plimsoll, who up to that point really knew so little about the Australian Army, he couldn't wear the uniform properly, didn't know how to salute, all these little things, but he had a brain. And he did this course with, say, 500 people, mainly Americans, but also some British and Canadians. He came second in the whole course.
Wow.
And
okay.
that was him. And
I wonder who came first.
Yeah, probably an American, but and he was going to be using what he'd learned there to go to Japan and help with the settling down of the country after the war. But I mean, at that stage, they didn't realize that the war was going to suddenly come to an end, as it did, and he was still in the United States and wondering what was going to happen to him. And apparently, he made a call on Alan Watt, who was then the counselor in the embassy, and just sort of a courtesy call, and Watt was just about to go back to Australia. Dr. Everett, who's the foreign minister, came through, and he was preparing a speech for what was going to be the inaugural meeting of the Far Eastern Commission, for which Everett, of course, hoped to become elected the chairman as well. Anyway.
Had a great sense of his own significant talents.
Yeah, and I think that he was a little mortified to find that there was nobody in the embassy who was going to be able to help him prepare his wonderful speech. And someone said, well, look, there's a young bloke out there called Major Plimsoll, may be able to help you. He's done a course on Japan, it might be of use. And so Plimsoll worked day and night for about, as he did when he got stuck into something, for about 2 or 3 days preparing the speech for Dr. Everett. And Everett thought it was absolutely wonderful, and he sort of took Plimsoll on for several months, just following Everett around. Plim, of course, was single, and he had no sort of heavy luggage or anything, just what he'd come to America with for this 6 weeks course. And he went with Everett on a visit to Japan, and he went on another trip to Japan with a whole lot of other people on this newly set up thing called the Far Eastern Commission. And gradually he just sort of merged into foreign affairs. It was a bit like that in those days. I mean, Everett and other people in the department who came across him realized he had enormous talent. I mean, he, amongst other things, he wrote a book for Dr. Everett. Ghost wrote it for him. He later did the same for R.G. Casey as well, but that was just what he could do. So he started off, and I remember reading that the embassy in Washington and the Australian permanent mission at the UN in New York were sort of fighting for his talents. They both wanted to use him.
And there's a few things to reflect on here, Jeremy. One, this is a young man. He's not even 30 by this stage. He's in his 20s, isn't he? Late 20s. And he's been given all these opportunities by significant figures, the Foreign Minister and people who are shaping Australian foreign policy, and he is part of that already at such a young age. The second thing I find interesting is that he was quite outspoken, or at least he was pretty frank with Dr. Everett, that he didn't agree with his politics, wasn't he? And Dr. Everett didn't seem to mind.
That's right. And he didn't mind. I mean, Everett was difficult to deal with, but Plimsoll wanted to stick by a point of view or an argument that he was trying to make with him. He'd stick with it, and he didn't mind having a bit of a row, but they'd all sort of cool down and carry on. Other people, of course, found Everett rather fearsome and worried about working with him.
So he ends up through this rather circuitous route, I guess, as it was in those days, with the rather small Department of External Affairs. I mean, we're not talking about a department of many thousands of people like it is today. This was a department of, 50? It wasn't.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
if that.
It was. I mean, if you drive down Commonwealth Avenue now in a southerly direction, as if going towards where DFAT is now, before you take the bend to the left, there's this red building. That was the Prime Minister's Department and the Attorney General's Department. And from 1935, when the External Affairs branch of Prime Minister's Department sort of broke away and became the Department of External Affairs, that's where it all was. I mean, it was tiny. That's where I started in 1959, and it was very small indeed.
So there's a change of government in 1949 with the election of Robert Menzies as Prime Minister, defeating the Chifley Labor government, which Dr. Everett had been part of. And this presents then an opportunity for James Plimsoll to move to another stage of his career, which is a fascinating one. What's going on in Korea, where the Cold War is starting to take root, and of course Australia is engaged in the UN-led operation to defend South Korea from the communists' invasion from the north.
And that was, in many ways, I think, Plimsoll's. I mean, he had many finest hours, but that was a really special one, because there he was. He had limited experience, but he just took up the job. He was the Australian representative on Kirk.
So this was the UN Commission
for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea, which was, of course, increasingly a dream.
But it was a significant body in Korea.
That's right.
And he's the Australian representative.
That's right.
And he's 33 years old.
Yep. That's right. And Unkirk became very, not only disillusioned, but rather afraid of the way that the war was going, with the North Koreans and their supporters coming down into South and almost looking as though they're going to be pushing them into the water. And Plimsoll said, it was at this meeting where all the members of Unkirk were saying, let's move to Japan. And Plimsoll said, no, we should stay here. And he eventually got his way, but only by insisting and by getting all the governments of the other member countries to agree as well. So it would not have looked good if Unkirk had moved out of Korea, but they stayed. He
had another significant intervention, didn't he, at Unkirk, given his influence on the Korean president Rhee.
Syngman Rhee, that's right, yes.
I mean, this is incredible to think this 33-year-old Australian, what he's able to achieve in terms of his influence over the Korean president.
Yes, it was. Yeah. I mean, he saved people's lives, because Rhee was full of ideas for just executing people who'd got in his way or disagreed with him and that sort of thing. And Plimsoll saved a number of lives, apparently, and Koreans never forgot that. But he also impressed the Americans, who were such a major presence there. And then Canberra thought it'd be a good idea to take him home, because he'd had a pretty hard time of it. And he settled into a quite senior job in Canberra. And then happened something that you very rarely have happen, and that is the Americans and the Koreans and other countries all said to Australia, please send him back. And they were rather reluctant.
We can't do this without him.
Yeah, and I mean, he was just so good and so impressive. And Canberra was a bit reluctant, because they wanted him to take a more senior job in the department. But the pressure was such that they thought it might be a good idea, and we'd only just joined. ANZUS had only just been signed. The Americans wanted Plimsoll back there, so back he went. And that doesn't happen very often, does it? And so he went back there for about another 6 months, I think it was, to help out. But he just had an extraordinary ability to work with people and had this incredible brain. He could think things through. He had a great memory, and he was very nice to people. And your father would be a great authority on this, because he used to go on a lot of his trips, I think, from Brussels, around Belgium and elsewhere. An unrivaled opportunity to talk to Plim.
Yes, of course. And you yourself knew James Plimsoll serving in Brussels at the same time as my father when he was there as ambassador. So you've got a first-hand experience of his talents. But Jeremy, the extraordinary set of circumstances in Korea, which James Plimsoll becomes incredibly well regarded for, was when he got up in the middle of the night, still in his pyjamas, to prevent President Rhee from fleeing the country, which he was intending to do. And somehow James Plimsoll was able to persuade the president to remain in Korea, which presumably was a way of preserving some level of stability in South Korea at least.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, how was he able to do this? This young man.
Yes, it is extraordinary, isn't it? People just listen to him. I mean, that's what he was supremely good at. I mean, he really was. He wasn't a bit of a disappointment, not a disaster or anything, but a bit of a disappointment when he achieved what's supposed to be the top job, which is the secretary in Canberra.
Yes, when he's appointed as secretary of the department, I think that's in 1965, so this is quite a few years on from his career days. As you say, that was an opportunity that most career diplomats would have aspired to. But for him, that was where he didn't shine. He was a poor administrator. He was much better at the strategy and negotiations and providing advice to ministers, but also providing advice to foreign counterparts. So, I mean, for someone who did have a glittering career and has given so much to Australia in terms of its reputation abroad and the decisions Australian governments were able to take through that very critical Cold War period, that was, for him, the real nadir of his career, wasn't it? In a way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, wherever he was sent, I think he did good things. I mean, he was very good at the UN when he was ambassador there. But you're right, I mean, he wasn't a great manager and he was a nice guy. I mean, he would want to see every third secretary going on their first post. And when they came back, he'd make time for that. He never stopped working, of course, but I think he thought of things very much more from the overseas side of the thing than the Canberra side of the thing. And although he'd had a bit of a grounding of working in Canberra in the period when Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister, and I think he had 7 years there straight, but it didn't quite make him into a Canberra bureaucrat. It just made him into a very good Foreign Affairs officer, and obviously one, I think, who made an enormous impression on not only Casey but also Menzies.
He served, before he becomes Secretary of External Affairs, he, as you mentioned before, he serves as the permanent representative to the Australian mission at the United Nations in New York. This was a time when, so the Menzies government is in power. This is a time when there are critical issues around the Australian mandated territories of Papua and New Guinea. And he's really, I guess, using that experience from being in Canberra and knowing the views or the likely views that Robert Menzies and his government would have on those issues and able to really articulate them to counterparts at the United Nations. How does he do this so effectively?
Yeah, well, he did it very effectively. People would always listen to him, whatever he said. But of course, in an issue like that, there were countries which their instructions from their home bases were that not to agree. We had to give them independence tomorrow, you know. But he was really good at doing that. But I think the other thing with Plim was that, as you will have seen, I think that his service during the war was very much bound up with Papua New Guinea and what its future was going to be. And I think he and others who were working away there in Melbourne were thinking quite hard about how that was going to all work out and what would be the best from an Australian point of view. So it was a particular interest of his. I think he would have liked to have been, if it could have worked, ambassador in Port Moresby. He would have loved to have had that job, but I think I said in the book that somebody thought he was too tall and someone thought he was too senior. Silly, but anyway.
Well, he obviously was incredibly effective despite his seniority and height. And he was an incredibly thin man as well. So I'm not sure, would that have set him back in certain environments? Who knows?
Incredibly
thin.
Slim?
Yes.
Yes. I think he had one or two brushes with ill health, but nothing that seemed to last very long, fortunately.
Jeremy is sent as ambassador to Washington And this is after Menzies has retired, and we are now going into the Holt, Gorton, McMahon era. And he has this extraordinary experience where he serves under 4 different prime ministers. So in fact, it's even more than that. I think it's 5. So he has the transition then to the Whitlam government during this time in Washington. And it's not without huge difficulties for James Plimsoll, is it? Where he navigates some incredibly tricky domestic issues in Australia and how they have an impact on Australia's relationship with the United States.
Yes, that's true. But I think that what helped there was that he went to Sunday school in Sydney with Margaret Whitlam, and I think he'd known, as a lot of diplomats always have, you get to know a lot of people who are in opposition because they travel in recess between parliamentary sessions, as you know, and quite sure he had got a good personal relationship with Gough and Margaret Whitlam from when they'd visited him in a very different post. I remember reading somewhere that Gough, I think maybe even told me that he had the experience of walking down a corridor at the UN with Plimsoll, and just about everyone coming the other way would be having a word with him or saying hello or something. Very popular, very well respected.
But there was an issue, wasn't there, with the Nixon administration? There had been certain comments made by Australian ministers and trade union officials that had got the Nixon administration very, very offside and refused to see certain Australian officials, including Whitlam.
Yeah, that's what they said, but I think when it actually came to the point, it wasn't all flags and everything. When Whitlam came through, I think he had 45 minutes with the president. That Plimsoll managed to get that for him. And I don't think there was quite so much hospitality for Whitlam on the part of the US administration. But Plimsoll knew them all, so he had an incredible number of dinners and lunches for Whitlam where he could meet all these key people in the administration at the Australian residence, regardless of how Nixon felt at things. Because, I mean, it was a big shock for people like Nixon. I mean, he first came to Canberra, I think, when he was a young vice president, and he was terribly impressed with Menzies, who took him aside and had a good chat with him and made a big impression on him. I just couldn't believe that all the sort of stuff that seemed to be coming out of Canberra with this new government.
So how did James Plimsoll handle that transition, do you think, from the 23 years of Liberal governments straight, I mean, quite an extraordinary period of just one side of politics dominating, to the Whitlam era from 72?
Difficult, but I think that he handled it as best he could. Fortunately, he had been there long enough to get to know all the key people in Washington that he needed to know, and he could talk to them, probably very frankly, off the record about how things were now in Australia and help them understand, because it was difficult for them, because a lot of Americans in very senior positions in Washington, perhaps less so nowadays, but in those days sometimes they'd certainly never been to Australia and often have travelled very little outside of the United States. So it was a very strange world that foreign diplomats had to try and interpret to them, but that was the challenge, I think, one of the challenges. But Plimsoll had an extraordinary standing, and even though it got to a stage where Nixon sort of said that I think Australia and Sweden were both in Coventry as far as he was concerned, and he wasn't going to have anything to do with the Australian ambassador. But William Rogers, the Secretary of State, and Kissinger and other people, they continued to quietly see Plimsoll at the residence or somewhere else, because they really wanted to talk to him, as well as, of course, Plimsoll wanted to talk to them. So, yes, strange time.
So, obviously, there were developments in the Soviet Union during that time too, and James Plimsoll, after leaving Washington, is sent directly to Moscow as ambassador, which would have been quite an extraordinary shift in gear from being Australia's ambassador to Washington to Australia's ambassador to Moscow. How did he assess the situations changing, and what was the advice he gave the Australian government in terms of its engagement with the Soviet Union through his period as ambassador there?
Well, I don't think he tried to make any great revolutionary changes, but just the sort of magic that a person like Plimsoll can weave, just do it bit by bit. I'm sure he would have been very happy to have stayed longer in Moscow than he did, because he was really doing some good things, wasn't he? And for an Australian ambassador, for any Western ambassador, because it's such a closed society then and very difficult to make any kind of contact, and the way he went about that with his incredible knowledge of literature and becoming a great friend of the English school at Moscow State University. And that was a wonderful thing to do and put him in touch with a lot of ordinary Russians. He was just a very capable, full ambassador who could see what was going to be in Australia's interest and how he personally could do something about it.
What about his advice to then Prime Minister Whitlam to recognise the Soviet sovereignty of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, at least in de jure sense? This caused a huge scandal back in Australia and, of course, with allies. The Liberal Party at the time, they criticised it. The allies were incredibly concerned at this change of policy from Australia. But Plimsoll was advocating for this to Whitlam, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, his view was that, well, Prime Minister, the politics is for you to handle, but I mean, the facts and the situation on the ground are such that it would just make a lot of sense if recognition was accorded. And so that was, I think, the way he saw it and the way he persuaded people in the Whitlam government to see it. He was criticised, it seemed to get known that he had been giving that advice, but it was thoughtful, far-seeing, and just one small step that you could take to try and have a better relationship with the Soviet Union.
And what was that the impact in the end, that the relationship with the Soviet Union softened a bit?
Probably a very tiny little bit, but it's just part of our way of trying to look at the world, I guess. Yeah, I think that in our Australian Foreign Service there's rightly a lot of emphasis put on relationship with China and Korea and Japan, but I do feel there's a lot more we could do with the relationship with Russia. It's a difficult relationship, but with the right kind of people there in our embassy, they would listen to us perhaps more than they might listen to some other people.
So James Plimsoll has to deal with yet another change of government in the election of Malcolm Fraser in 1975 after the dismissal of Gough Whitlam's Labor government. And this becomes quite a challenging period, doesn't it, for James Plimsoll, because he doesn't get on very well with Fraser.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I had some dealings with Malcolm Fraser, and it's not particularly relevant, but I mean, he wasn't an easy man to deal with, it seemed to me, but he had some good ideas, and you just had to try and work with him. I'm not sure that he particularly didn't get on with Fraser. I don't think there have been too many occasions, if any, that Plimsoll would have had to see Fraser face to face.
In relation to the European Economic Community, it's observed that Plimsoll perhaps didn't get the right gauge on what the Fraser government's policy was in relation to Europe dumping its subsidised agricultural products into markets that were being developed by Australia. And this really got Fraser offside with Plimsoll. Well, probably the other way around. Plimsoll got offside on the wrong side of Fraser, where he wasn't really responding to the government's policy of the day, which maybe reflected, do you think, the fact he'd been out of the country for quite some time and maybe hadn't been in touch with Australia's political leaders?
Fraser, as you know, was a very unusual Prime Minister. I had rather easier dealings with him because he was very wound up with Zimbabwe and I was the first one in there, and so that made it very easy. That was a subject that was easy to talk to him about, and he just wanted to do as much as he possibly could. I mean, I had 10 minutes with him before I went there, and he said, as I walked out the door, he said, if you think we need to give more aid, just say so. Which I did.
Yeah, that's a nice message to take with you.
Yeah.
You served under James Plimsoll when he was ambassador in Brussels, so he would have been dealing with the European Economic Community issues there. How did you find him as an ambassador, and what were the issues you worked together on when you were there?
Well, we were very much caught up at the time with the aftermath of a visit that Malcolm Fraser had made as Prime Minister in May or so 1977. He'd been out to London for some anniversary of the Queen's reign, I think, and then he was going to do a few posts around Europe, and I think it started off as a fairly sort of casual idea, and he got quite interested and involved and quite determined to try and do something about the European community's agricultural policies. So he had a rather stormy, short visit in Brussels. This was before Plimsoll got there, but Plimsoll got there he arrived in Brussels at the very same moment. The delegation was coming from Australia, led by a young, virtually unknown minister called John Howard, which was going to go storming around all the European countries and trying to get them to see differently about agricultural protectionism. And, well, I think that on the one hand, an ambassador is always trying to respond to something that Canberra's interested in at the time, but I think you have to, at the same time, try and see the longer view and that we've got other irons in the fire. There are limits to what you can do about, say, trying to do something about agriculture. But the whole thing, Fraser being a farmer himself, was so taken up with this, and he sent out this specially set up department, a small separate department of the government in Canberra to try and deal with this matter. Special Trade Representations, I think it was called, and Howard was the first minister, and until he suddenly became promoted to be treasurer.
Indeed.
But anyway, these delegations kept coming to Brussels and also going to other capitals in Europe, and it wasn't easy, and maybe they made a few steps. And I think in my book I've got something about how Roy Jenkins, who was the president of the European Community at the time, said that a lot of the credit for the progress that had been made was due to Plimsoll.
And after Brussels, he's appointed very briefly
London.
London, which he presumably would have loved the posting, but as a career diplomat, you often have to cede your spot, your appointment to a political appointee, which was the case for him. And then he got a nice sort of compensation, I guess, by finishing his diplomatic career back really where he started in Tokyo, which is a lovely circularity in the journey he had.
Yeah, you could see it from that point of view, but I think he was really bitterly disappointed about having to leave London, because he would have loved the job, he would have been excellent at it. He would have known so many people in London that he could have worked with, because he'd known them for years. And there's a long line of Plimsolls who were in the UK before they came to Australia. I mean, it really would have meant a lot to him, and it was just very sad that he had to yield the place and go somewhere else. But I don't think that he was really in Tokyo as ambassador very long, and didn't really get too far into it until suddenly somebody rang him up from Tasmania.
And this came as quite a surprise, wasn't it, to be offered the governorship of Tasmania, and a lovely bookend to his career in a way.
Yeah.
Because he was quite worried about retirement, wasn't he?
Yes, he had no idea what he was going to do with himself. It's funny, isn't it? But that was the way of Plimsoll. He just worked, and he didn't really think about anything else, didn't think forward about what was going to happen in retirement. I somehow think that it probably wouldn't have been such a problem, because I think that there would have been lots of people who would have wanted to tap his knowledge and talent, and he would have found it much more interesting than he thought it was going to be. But anyway, he was lucky that that job came up, because it was a job that he really seemed to have thoroughly enjoyed, put everything into it, and I mean, even to the extent of saying, looking at his engagement for the next 2 weeks and seeing some gaps and saying, well, look, there's a gap there, we must fill that.
An incredible work ethic. He was completely married to his job and career, but he didn't have anyone in his life, really, which is somewhat sad in a way, because he didn't share his experiences with family. It was a solo enterprise for him, and he was known for working 80-hour weeks. He never bought a house. He lived in the Hotel Canberra, I think. Very, very frugal person, wore the same suit till it sort of fell off him, which is hard to imagine for being such a esteemed diplomat. I mean, I think my father calls him Australia's greatest diplomat, yet he must have looked a little bit shabby in that same old suit.
Yeah, you'd think so. I never thought of it that way, but I mean, it's true. It must have been the case, because I mean, there are times when he would, I think it's in the book somewhere, that I was setting off for some Defence Committee meeting during the Vietnam War, and he was secretary, and his secretary in his office noticed that his jacket was falling to pieces or something, and she did some quick repair before he went off to the meeting.
Something he did find difficult was how to accommodate the changing status of women in Australian professional life. And it was remarked to me when speaking to people about him, and we're here in Canberra and his legend lives on, that he was quite opposed to the progression of women in the department, and in fact found female counterparts or fellow diplomats quite hard to deal with.
I don't know, because I didn't really see it. I don't think when Alexander and I were there, I don't think there were any women in the embassy. I think Alexander's predecessor, Lydia Morton, but she'd gone before Plimsoll came there. I think that's probably a fair summary, because I think he didn't easily settle down, relax with women, but he could gradually. I mean, I remember we had an Australian admiral to dinner in Brussels, and it was just informal, and Kay and me and the admiral and Plimsoll, that's right, and he came to dinner. And he was when he was new there, he didn't know anybody, so we used to have him do a few odd things, and I spilt some tomato soup on the admiral's clothing as I was taking it round, and Plimsoll straight away said, "Didn't Jeremy tell you to wear a red shirt?"
So he was able to use wit and humour to get through difficult situations. What do you think, Jeremy, having researched his entire career, is his greatest legacy to Australia's place in the world?
Well, I think firstly that every diplomat tries their best to portray Australia in a favourable light. In the period that your father and I worked in, it's been a period where we're only still sometimes just making people realise that there is a country called Australia there. And so it's hard work sometimes, but people who knew Plimsoll would have a much more favourable impression of Australia, I'm sure. And of course, for a lot of people in the world, as you know, Australia's not the first country they think about every morning when they get up and have breakfast. But Plimsoll would have, I think, made an enormous impact on people on a personal basis in so many different situations and postings. I mean, when you started talking about career, to actually ask the government of a country to send the diplomat back, that happens very, very rarely. I've never heard of another case of that. It may have happened, but I've never heard of any other case. So he did make a remarkable impact on people.
It's extraordinary to think of the impact that he was making on the world stage at the same time as Robert Menzies was really forging his not just domestic political career, but a career as an international statesman through so many really significant events through World War II and then the Cold War, that we had those two individuals making Australia really a much more prominent country in the world's eyes than we might otherwise have been, given the progression of our country from federation.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, when you're talking about Prime Minister Menzies, of course, he was very good when he went overseas and he did everything right. But I think he was one of those, well, maybe it was the era where he thought, well, I've got to do what I have to do overseas. But I think for him, he was very focused on the job at home. He knew he had to do certain things overseas, but I think that was a particular focus for him. So I think that was the way he saw it. But he was very good, and I think that people like Plimsoll found it terrific to work with him because he was so bright, intelligent, and the fact that he really liked to just have someone like Plimsoll come in and talk to him about a problem and then decide, not spend so much time reading all the papers about it.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy Herder, for coming on Afternoon Light. It's been a fascinating discussion about an extremely important Australian who made such a contribution to our place and reputation in the world.
Thank you. Pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.